I thought the worst day of my life was when the doctor told me I had breast cancer at 68. I was wrong. The worst day of my life was last Thursday, when a woman named Elena Vasquez called to tell me she'd been married to my husband for 32 years. My name is Ruth Elaine Morrison, and I'm 75 years old. For 40 years, I believed I was the only woman Harold Morrison had ever truly loved. We met in 1983 when I was 35 and he was 38. Both of us divorced, both of us gun-shy about marriage, and both of us working at the same insurance company in Minneapolis. He was the claims investigator with the gentle smile and careful hands. I was the office manager who kept everyone's lives organized while my own fell apart every weekend. Our courtship was slow and sweet, the kind of love story middle-aged people write when they've learned the difference between passion and partnership. Harold brought me coffee every morning in a mug that said "World's Best Boss," even though technically we were equals. He stayed late to help me reconcile the monthly reports, and I saved him pieces of birthday cake from office parties he was too shy to attend. We married in 1984 in a small ceremony at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, with my teenage daughter Amanda as my maid of honor and Harold's brother Frank as his best man. Harold wore a navy suit that brought out his blue eyes, and I wore a cream-colored dress that made me feel beautiful for the first time since my divorce. We honeymooned in Door County, Wisconsin, staying in a bed and breakfast where Harold read mystery novels aloud while I worked crossword puzzles. For 40 years, that was our life. Quiet, predictable, comfortable. Harold worked his way up to senior investigator, and I eventually became the office manager for the entire Minneapolis branch. We bought a ranch house in Bloomington, planted tomatoes every spring, and took 2-week vacations to places like Glacier National Park and the Wisconsin Dells. We weren't rich, but we were content. Harold retired 3 years ago when his arthritis made it too painful to spend long days at accident scenes. I retired 6 months later, and we settled into the routine of elderly married couples everywhere. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks around the neighborhood, and evening news followed by whatever was on the History Channel. We had our struggles. The breast cancer scare in 2016 that turned out to be benign but left us both shaken. Amanda's messy divorce in 2019 had her and the grandkids living with us for 8 months. Harold's mild heart attack last year sent him to the cardiac unit for 4 days and made me realize how lost I'd be without him. But we weathered all of it together. Or so I thought. The phone call came at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon while Harold was at his weekly appointment with the cardiologist. I was in the kitchen making a grocery list, mentally planning the pot roast I'd cook for dinner, when the phone rang. "Mrs. Morrison?" The voice was female, middle-aged, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Ruth Morrison?" "Yes, this is Ruth. My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm calling about Harold Morrison, your husband." Something in her voice made my stomach clench. "What about Harold? Has something happened? Is he all right?" There was a long pause. Then, "Mrs. Morrison, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it gently. Harold Morrison is my husband, too." The words didn't make sense at first. They hung in the air like a foreign language I'd never learned. "Harold Morrison is my husband, too." "I'm sorry," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "I think there's been some mistake. My husband's name is Harold Morrison, but 77 years old. Born in Duluth, works for Midwest Insurance, has a scar on his left hand from when he fell off his bike as a kid." Each detail hit me like a physical blow. How could this stranger know these things about my Harold? "That's impossible," I whispered. "I know how this sounds, Mrs. Morrison. I know you must think I'm crazy or lying or both. But I've been married to Harold Morrison since 1991. We have 2 children together, Miguel, who's 31, and Sofia, who's 28. We live in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio. Harold's business trips to San Antonio. For 32 years, Harold had traveled to San Yel, Antonio 4 times a year for regional conferences and training seminars. I'd never questioned it because Harold had never given me a reason to doubt him. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Because Harold had another heart attack yesterday. A big one. He's in intensive care at Methodist Hospital, and the doctors don't think he's going to make it." The kitchen started spinning. Harold was supposed to be at Dr. Patterson's office 15 minutes away, getting his monthly checkup, probably complaining about the new blood pressure medication that made him dizzy. Harold wasn't supposed to be dying in a hospital in Texas, surrounded by children I'd never heard of and a wife I'd never imagined. "That can't be right," I said. "Harold's not in San Antonio. He's here. He's at the doctor." "Mrs. Morrison, when was the last time you actually saw your husband?" I tried to think. Harold had kissed me goodbye that morning before leaving for his appointment. But wait, that was yesterday morning. Yesterday, Harold had said he was going to Dr. Patterson's office. And then he'd mentioned stopping by the hardware store and maybe visiting his brother Frank. But Harold hadn't come home last night. I'd fallen asleep on the couch watching the news, assuming Harold was having dinner with Frank like he sometimes did after his appointments. When I'd woken up at midnight and found Harold's side of the bed empty, I'd figured he'd decided to spend the night at Frank's rather than wake me. This morning, I'd found a note on the kitchen counter. "Had to leave early for a work emergency. Back in a few days, love you. H. A work emergency." Harold had been retired for 3 years. "Mrs. Morrison? Are you still there?" "I need to call you back," I managed to say. "Wait, please. I know this is a shock, but there's something else you need to know. The doctors say Harold's been asking for Ruth. He keeps saying he needs to tell Ruth something important before he dies. I think he wants to see you." I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen, staring at the grocery list I'd been writing when my world collapsed. Milk, eggs, bread, and ground beef for the pot roast I'd never cook for the husband who'd apparently been living a double life for 32 years. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like the state of Wisconsin, was Harold's business card from his active years. Harold Morrison, Senior Claims Investigator, Midwest Insurance Company. I'd looked at that card thousands of times over the years. Now I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. At the bottom, in small print, it listed 2 office locations: Minneapolis, Minnesota, and San Antonio, Texas. After Elena Vasquez hung up, I sat in my kitchen for 2 hours, staring at Harold's business card and trying to make sense of 32 years of lies. The Minneapolis office address was familiar: 2150 Highway 100 South, the building where Harold and I had met, where we'd worked together for 15 years before I transferred to a different branch. But the San Antonio address might as well have been on Mars for all the attention I'd paid to it over the years. I'd been married to Harold for 40 years, and I'd never once asked him what he did during his quarterly trips to Texas. Regional conferences, he'd always said when I asked about the trips. Training seminars for new claims procedures. Company policy updates. Boring stuff you wouldn't be interested in. And I'd believed him because Harold was the most honest person I'd ever known. He was the man who'd drive back to the grocery store to return $1 in incorrect change, who'd never cheated on his taxes, and who'd confessed to me about every woman he'd dated before we met, because he said marriage should start with complete honesty. How had I missed 32 years of deception from someone I thought was incapable of lying? I started going through Harold's things, looking for evidence of the double life Elena Vasquez claimed he'd been living. In our bedroom, I searched through his dresser drawers, his closet, and his nightstand. Everything looked normal: reading glasses, blood pressure medication, mystery novels, and the watch I'd given him for our 20th anniversary. But then I found something that stopped me cold. In Harold's sock drawer, underneath the pair of Argyle socks I'd bought him last Christmas, was a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, spanning what looked like 3 decades. Harold with a beautiful Hispanic woman who had to be Elena. Harold holding a baby. Harold is teaching a little boy to ride a bicycle. Harold was walking a young woman down an aisle in what was clearly a wedding ceremony. The photographs told the story of a complete parallel life. Birthday parties in backyards I'd never seen. Christmas mornings around trees I'd never helped decorate. Family vacations to places Harold and I had never visited together. In one photo, Harold was standing next to a "for sale" sign in front of a Spanish-style house, his arm around Elena, both of them beaming. The date stamped on the back read March 1993, 9 years into our marriage, when Harold had told me he was attending a 3-day training conference on fraud investigation. I sat on our bed, surrounded by evidence of Harold's other family, and tried to understand how this was possible. How does someone maintain 2 complete lives for 32 years? How does someone love 2 different women, father children with one while being stepfather to another's, celebrate 2 sets of anniversaries, and never once slip up? The logistics alone seemed impossible. Harold had never been gone for more than 5 days at a time. His San Antonio trips were always scheduled months in advance, noted on our shared kitchen calendar in his careful handwriting. He'd call me every night when he was away, usually around 8 p.m. Central Time, to ask about my day and tell me how much he missed me. But now I realize those phone calls could have been made from anywhere. From Elena's kitchen while she cleaned up after dinner. From his son Miguel's apartment while they watched a baseball game. From the hospital room where his daughter Sofia had given birth to grandchildren I'd never known existed. I kept digging through Harold's belongings, and the evidence kept accumulating. A spare cell phone hidden in his golf bag, programmed with numbers and Texas area codes. Credit card statements I'd never seen, showing purchases at restaurants and stores in San Antonio. A second driver's license with an address I didn't recognize. The most damning evidence was a life insurance policy I'd never heard of $500,000. Policy with Elena Vasquez listed as the sole beneficiary. The premium payments had been automatically deducted from a checking account I knew nothing about. An account funded by Harold's consulting work for a San Antonio-based insurance company. Consulting work that, I now realized, was probably his full-time job with his second family. I called the number Elena had given me, and she answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Morrison? Ruth? I need to understand something," I said. "How long have you known about me?" There was a long pause. "I've always known about you. Harold told me about his first wife in Minneapolis when we started dating. He said you'd been married for a few years, but that it wasn't working out, that you were planning to divorce." "We never planned to divorce. We've been married for 40 years. That's not what Harold told me. He said you were divorced in 1987, that you'd remained friends, but had gone your separate ways." 1987. That was the year Harold had been promoted to senior investigator, the year his travel schedule had increased, and the year he'd started spending more time in San Antonio. "Elena," I said carefully, "what did Harold tell you about his work schedule?" "He worked for Midwest Insurance here in San Antonio, but he had to travel to Minneapolis once a quarter for regional meetings. He'd be gone for 3 or 4 days each trip. He always hated it, said Minneapolis was too cold and he missed us too much. The perfect mirror image of the story he'd told me. To Elena, I was the obligation, the boring work commitment that took him away from his real family. To me, Elena and her children were the work responsibilities that required his professional attention. Do your children know about me? Miguel and Sofia know their father travels for work, but they don't know he's still married to someone else. Harold always said it would be too confusing for them when they were young, and now—" She paused. "Mrs. Morrison, my children think Harold is their father. They've never known any other dad. If Harold dies without telling them the truth, I don't know how I'll explain any of this. Harold had children in Texas who loved him, who thought he was a devoted family man, who occasionally had to travel for boring insurance meetings. And I had a husband in Minnesota who'd loved me enough to build a 40-year marriage while simultaneously building an entirely separate family 1,000 miles away. "Elena," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did Harold love you?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "He loved me completely. When he was here, he was completely present, coaching Miguel's baseball games, walking Sofia down the aisle at her wedding, and helping me take care of my mother when she had Alzheimer's. He was a wonderful husband and father. And when he was gone, he missed us terribly. He'd call every night, sometimes twice. He'd send postcards from Minneapolis, little gifts for the kids. He'd count down the days until he could come home to us, just like he'd counted down the days until he could come home to me." I realized then that this wasn't a story about a man who'd lied to two women. This was a story about a man who'd somehow managed to live two completely authentic lives, loving two families with equal devotion, never choosing between us because he'd found a way to have both. The question that was tearing me apart wasn't whether Harold had loved me. It was whether the love he'd given me was enough, knowing that half his heart had always belonged to someone else. I'd never been to Texas, never had any reason to visit the state where my husband had spent a quarter of his adult life building a family I knew nothing about. As the plane descended toward San Antonio International Airport, I pressed my face to the window and tried to imagine Harold navigating these roads, coming home to Elena's house, helping Miguel with homework, and teaching Sofia to drive. Elena met me at baggage claim, and I recognized her immediately from the photographs I'd found in Harold's sock drawer. She was still beautiful at 63, with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of warm brown eyes that probably made Harold feel safe after long days investigating insurance fraud. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, approaching me cautiously. "Ruth, thank you for coming." We stood there for a moment, two women who'd shared the same man for 32 years without knowing it, trying to figure out how to greet each other. Finally, Elena stepped forward and embraced me, and I was surprised by how natural it felt. "How is Harold?" I asked as we walked to her car. "Stable, but not improving. The doctors say his heart is just worn out. Too many years of stress, too much damage from the first attack." She paused. "He's been asking for you constantly. 'Tell Ruth I'm sorry,' he keeps saying. 'Tell Ruth I need to explain.'" The drive to Methodist Hospital took us through neighborhoods I'd never imagined Harold knowing. Strip malls where he'd probably bought groceries, parks where he'd probably taken his Texas grandchildren, and restaurants where he'd probably celebrated Elena's birthdays while I was in Minneapolis, wondering why he seemed distant during his post-trip phone calls. "Elena," I said as we sat in traffic, "I need to ask you something. Did you ever suspect? In 32 years, did you ever wonder if Harold was hiding something?" She was quiet for a long time. "Sometimes," she said finally. "There were little things that didn't quite make sense. He never wanted me to call him at his hotel when he was traveling. He said the company had strict policies about personal calls, but that always seemed odd. And he was very private about his work in Minneapolis. Never talked about colleagues there, never brought home stories from the office." "What about money? How did he support two families?" "Harold made good money as a senior investigator here. And he always said he got extra pay for the travel work and bonuses for handling the Minneapolis accounts. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. He paid for Miguel's college and helped with Sofia's wedding. I never questioned where the money came from. I thought about our own finances in Minneapolis. Harold had always handled the investments, the insurance policies, and the long-term financial planning. I'd trusted him completely, never asked to see statements or questioned his decisions. Now I realized he'd probably been supporting Elena's family on money I'd assumed was going into our joint retirement fund. Methodist Hospital was a sprawling complex that reminded me of the Mayo Clinic, where Harold and I had gone for his heart attack last year. Elena led me through a maze of corridors to the cardiac intensive care unit, where Harold lay connected to machines that beeped and hummed with the rhythm of his failing heart. He looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the weight of secrets that had finally become too heavy to carry. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, and his skin was the gray color of someone whose body was slowly shutting down. "Harold," Elena said softly, taking his hand. "Ruth is here." His eyes fluttered open, and when he saw me, his face crumpled with relief and something that might have been shame. "Ruth," he whispered. "You came." Of course I came. I moved to the other side of his bed, taking his free hand. "Harold, we need to talk." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Ruth. I never meant for it to happen this way." "How did it happen, Harold? Help me understand." He closed his eyes, gathering what little strength he had left. "When I started traveling to San Antonio in 1987, I was lonely. You and I were going through that rough patch after Amanda's problems, and I was spending 4 days every quarter in a city where I didn't know anyone. I started having dinner at the same restaurant near my hotel, and Elena was a waitress there." I looked across the bed at Elena, who was crying quietly. "We started talking," Harold continued. "Just friendly conversation at first. She was recently divorced, struggling to raise 2 young kids on her own. I was feeling disconnected from you, unsure if our marriage was going to survive Amanda's teenage rebellion and your mother's illness." I remembered that time. 1987 had been a difficult year for us. My mother had been diagnosed with dementia. Amanda had been arrested twice for underage drinking. And Harold and I had been fighting constantly about money and responsibility, and whether we were strong enough to handle all the crisis, points that seemed to be hitting us at once. "Elena." "And I became friends first," Harold said. "I'd look forward to the San Antonio trips because I knew I'd have someone to talk to who wasn't angry with me, who didn't see me as the person who was failing to fix everything." "When did friendship become more?" I asked. 1989. Elena's ex-husband stopped paying child support, and she was about to lose her apartment. I helped her with the rent, and one thing led to another. By 1991, we were in love, and she was pregnant with our son. Our son. Miguel was Harold's biological child, not just Elena's son he'd helped raise. I had a stepson I'd never met and grandchildren I'd never seen. "Why didn't you just divorce me?" I asked. "If you loved Elena, if you were starting a family with her, why maintain 2 marriages?" Harold's eyes filled with tears. "Because I loved you too, Ruth. I loved you both in different ways, for different reasons. You were my stability, my history, the woman who'd chosen me when I was damaged from my first divorce. Elena was my adventure, my second chance, the woman who made me feel young and needed again. So you decided to keep both of us." I told myself it was temporary, that I'd figure out what to do, make a choice, and find a way to do the right thing. But months turned into years, and both lives became so important to me that I couldn't imagine giving up either one. Elena spoke from the other side of the bed. "Harold told me you were divorced. For 32 years, I believed I was his only wife. And I never suspected there was anyone else," I said. "Harold, how did you do it? How did you keep 2 complete lives separate for so long?" "Very carefully," he whispered. "Different bank accounts, different credit cards, different cell phones. I memorized 2 sets of birthdays, anniversaries, and family stories. I lived in constant fear that I'd slip up, call one of you by the wrong name, or mention something from the wrong life." "Did you ever want to tell us?" "Every day, but I was terrified of losing both of you. I convinced myself that what you didn't know couldn't hurt you, that I was making both of you happy by giving you the best version of myself I could manage." I looked at this man I'd loved for 40 years, This man who'd lived a double life with such skill that neither of his wives had suspected anything. I should have been furious. I should have been screaming at him, demanding to know how he could betray me so completely for so long. Instead, I found myself thinking about Elena, crying quietly on the other side of Harold's hospital bed. She'd lost her husband too. She'd been living a lie just as devastating as mine, just as complete, just as designed to protect her from a truth that would have destroyed the family she'd built. "Harold," I said, "do Miguel and Sofia know I exist?" No, Elena and I agreed it would be too confusing for them when they were young. And as they got older, the lie became too big to undo without destroying their respect for me. "They need to know," Elena said suddenly. "If you die, Harold, they need to understand why there's another woman at your funeral, why their father's obituary mentions a wife they've never heard of." "Will you tell them?" Harold asked me. "Will you help Elena explain?" I looked at Elena, this woman who'd unknowingly shared my husband for 3 decades and made a decision that surprised me. "We'll tell them together," I said. Miguel and Sofia arrived at the hospital an hour later, and I saw immediately why Harold had fallen in love with being their father. Miguel was 31, tall and lean like Harold, with Elena's warm brown eyes and an engineer's careful way of speaking. Sofia was 28, pregnant with her second child, and radiating the kind of confident maternal energy that reminded me of myself when Amanda was small. They rushed to Harold's bedside with the urgent affection of adult children who'd been raised by someone who made them feel unconditionally loved. Watching them, I felt a sharp stab of envy, not because Harold loved them, but because they'd had 40 years of believing their father was exactly who he appeared to be. "Dad," Miguel said. Taking Harold's hand, we came as soon as Mom called. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that you're here," Harold whispered. "Miguel, Sofia, there's someone I need you to meet. This is Ruth Morrison." Sofia looked at me politely, probably assuming I was a family friend or hospital chaplain. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Morrison." "Ruth is my wife," Harold said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Miguel and Sofia process what Harold had just said, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to something approaching horror. "What do you mean, your wife?" Miguel asked. "Mom is your wife." "I have 2 wives," Harold said, his voice getting weaker with the effort of this confession. "I've been married to your mother since 1991, and to Ruth since 1984. They both knew about the other marriage until yesterday." Sofia sat down hard in the visitor's chair, one hand on her pregnant belly. "That's impossible." "Dad, that's not... You can't be married to 2 people at the same time." "Legally, he's only married to me," I said gently. "Harold and I were married in Minnesota in 1984. His marriage to your mother was a ceremony but not a legal contract." "So you're telling us," Miguel said, his voice rising, "that our parents' marriage is fake? That our father is a bigamist? That everything we've believed about our family is a lie?" "Your parents' love is real," I said quickly. "Their commitment to each other is real. The only thing that's fake is the paperwork." "Ruth," Elena said, shooting me a grateful look. "Miguel, Sofia, your father loved me completely. He was a devoted husband and father to us. The fact that he had another family doesn't change how real our family was." "Another family?" Sofia's eyes were filling with tears. "You have other children?" "No," I said. "I have a daughter from my first marriage, but Harold and I never had biological children together." "Miguel and Sofia, you're Harold's only biological children. You and your children are his only grandchildren." I don't know why I said that. Maybe because I could see how devastated they were, how completely their understanding of their father had been shattered in the space of 5 minutes. Maybe because I remembered what it felt like to discover that the person you'd trusted most in the world had been living a lie. "How?" Miguel asked. "How did you manage 2 families for 30 years? Harold struggled to sit up straighter, and Elena adjusted his pillows. I told each family that I had to travel for work. To Ruth, I said I had quarterly conferences in San Antonio. To you, I said I had meetings in Minneapolis. Neither family questioned it, because business travel was normal and expected. Every 3 months, Sofia said slowly, you'd leave us for 4 or 5 days and go live with her? I lived with both of you, Harold said. Ruth, I need you to know that when I was in Minneapolis, I was completely present with you. When I was in San Antonio, I was completely present with Elena and the children. I never gave half my attention to either family. But you gave half your life to each family, I said. For 40 years, I got 75% of your time, and Elena's family got 25%. We both thought we had all of you, but we were sharing you. Miguel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the San Antonio skyline. Dad, do you have any idea what this does to us? Finding out that the man we've looked up to our entire lives is a liar? That our family is built on fraud? I'm not a liar about the important things, Harold said desperately. I loved your mother. I love both of you. I was proud to be your father, proud to coach your baseball games and walk Sofia down the aisle. None of that was fake. But it was incomplete, Sofia said. Every family dinner, every holiday, every birthday party, you were thinking about them too, weren't you? Wishing you could be with them instead, or feeling guilty for being with us. Harold closed his eyes. Sometimes. But Sofia, when I was with you, when I was teaching you to drive or helping you with college applications, you had my full attention. You had my whole heart in those moments. Just not our whole life, Miguel said bitterly. Elena stood up from her chair beside Harold's bed. Miguel, Sofia, I understand you're angry. I'm angry too. But your father is dying, and this might be the last conversation we ever have with him. Do you want to spend it fighting, or do you want to spend it trying to understand? Sofia wiped her eyes and looked at me. Mrs. Morrison, Ruth, what do you want from us? Why did you come here? It was a fair question, and I realized I didn't have a simple answer. I wanted to meet the family that's been sharing my husband for 30 years. I wanted to understand how Harold could love me for 40 years while building a life with someone else. And I suppose I wanted to see if the children he raised were worth the lie he told me. And? Miguel asked. You are. Watching you both with Harold, seeing how much you love him and how much he loves you, I can understand why he couldn't give this up. I can understand why he thought keeping all of us was better than choosing between us. Are you saying you forgive him? Sofia asked. I'm saying I understand him. Whether I can forgive him? That's something I'll have to figure out after he's gone. Harold reached for both Elena's hand and mine. I know I don't deserve forgiveness from any of you. I know what I did was selfish and wrong, but I need you all to know that every day of both my lives was better because I had you in it. Ruth, you gave me stability and partnership and the kind of steady love that carried me through every crisis. Elena, Miguel, and Sofia, you gave me adventure and purpose and the joy of watching a family grow. Dad, Miguel said, coming back from the window, what happens now? When you die, how do we handle this? Do we have joint funerals? Do we split your ashes? Do we pretend we don't know each other? It was a practical question that none of us had considered, but it cut to the heart of our impossible situation. Harold had created 2 grieving families who now had to figure out how to honor the man who'd belonged to both of us and neither of us. We'll figure it out together, Elena said, looking at me. Ruth and I will figure out how to do this right. I nodded, surprising myself. Yes, we'll figure it out together. Harold smiled for the first time since I'd arrived in San Antonio. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you both. Harold died 3 days later, on a Sunday morning while Elena and I were both holding his hands. His last words were, I'm sorry, repeated over and over like a prayer he hoped might earn him forgiveness in whatever comes after a life built on loving deception. Elena and I stayed with his body for an hour after the machine stopped beeping. Neither of us ready to let go of the man who'd somehow managed to be a devoted husband to both of us for 3 decades. Planning Harold's funeral became an exercise in impossible logistics. How do you honor a man who lived 2 complete lives without making either family feel like they were the secret, the shame, or the afterthought? We decided on 2 services, one in San Antonio, where Harold would be buried in the plot he'd purchased years earlier next to the space reserved for Elena. One in Minneapolis, where our friends and my daughter Amanda could say goodbye to the Harold Morrison they'd known. But first, Elena and I had to tell our communities the truth about who Harold really was. The hardest conversation was with Amanda, my 50-year-old daughter, who'd considered Harold her stepfather for 40 years. I called her from my hotel room in San Antonio the night after Harold died. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she said as soon as she heard my voice. "I know how much you loved Harold. Do you need me to fly down there? I can be on a plane tomorrow." "Amanda, there's something about Harold that I need to tell you, something I just learned myself." I explained everything: Elena, Miguel, Sofia, the double life, and the 2 families. Amanda listened in complete silence until I finished. "Mom," she said finally, "are you telling me that Harold was a bigamist? That the man who walked me down the aisle at my wedding, who was grandfather to my kids, and who I've called Dad for 4 decades, was living a secret life in Texas?" "Yes, holy shit. Mom, I'm sorry, but holy shit. How are you handling this? How are you not completely falling apart?" "Because falling apart won't change anything," I said. "Harold's gone, Amanda. Being angry at him won't bring him back, and it won't erase the 40 years of love he gave us. It'll just make his death harder than it already is." "But Mom, he lied to you. For your entire marriage, he was lying to you. He was also loving me. Every morning when he brought me coffee, every night when he held me while we watched television, every time he told me he loved me, that was real. The fact that he was also loving Elena doesn't make his love for me fake. How can you be so calm about this?" I thought about Elena, sleeping in the next room of our shared hotel suite, exhausted from 3 days of watching the man she loved die. I thought about Miguel and Sofia, grappling with the reality that their father had been someone completely different from who they'd believed him to be. I thought about Harold himself, carrying the weight of 2 families' worth of love and lies until his heart literally couldn't take it anymore. "Because being calm is the only way to get through this," I told Amanda. Harold made an impossible choice 30 years ago, and then he spent the rest of his life trying to honor both parts of that choice. I can't change what he did, but I can choose how I respond to it. The San Antonio funeral was held at Elena's Catholic Church, attended by Harold's Texas family and the co-workers who'd known him as a devoted family man who occasionally had to travel for business. I sat in the front pew next to Elena, Miguel, and Sofia and listened to stories about the Harold Morrison who'd coached Little League Baseball, who'd danced at Sofia's wedding, and who'd taught Miguel to change a tire. The priest, who'd known Harold for 20 years, spoke about the complexity of love and the mystery of human hearts. "Harold Morrison was a man who loved deeply and completely," he said. "Today, we don't gather to judge the choices he made, but to celebrate the love he gave and the lives he touched." After the service, Miguel approached me at the graveside. "Ruth, I want you to know that I've been thinking about what you said in the hospital, about how we were worth the lie Dad told you. But I don't think that's right." "What do you mean?" "I think you were worth the lie he told us too. Dad spent 30 years protecting all of us from a truth he thought would destroy our families. Maybe he was wrong to lie, but maybe he was right that the truth would have hurt more than we could have handled." Sofia joined us, her 2-year-old daughter on her hip. "Ruth, I want to ask you something. If you had known about us from the beginning, what would you have done?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'd like to think I would have been understanding, that I would have found a way to make it work. But honestly, I probably would have demanded that Harold choose between us. And if he'd chosen us, Then I would have lost 40 years with a man who loved me, and you would have lost the chance to know that your father was capable of loving more than one family at a time. Elena approached us as we stood around Harold's grave, and I realized we looked like what we were, a fractured family trying to understand how to be whole. "Ruth," she said, "I have something I need to give you." She handed me a manila envelope. Inside were dozens of letters Harold had written but never sent. Letters to me, dated over the span of 30 years, explaining his double life, asking for forgiveness, and trying to find words for the impossible situation he'd created. "He wrote these whenever he felt guilty about lying to you," Elena said, "usually after he'd had to miss something important in Minneapolis because of something important happening here. Miguel's graduation, Sofia's wedding, the birth of their children." I opened one of the letters, dated December 1995. "My dearest Ruth," it read, "today Sofia took her first steps, and I wished more than anything that you could have been here to see it. I know you would have loved her like your own granddaughter and would have cheered just as loudly as Elena and I did. I'm starting to realize that keeping you and Elena apart isn't just hurting me, it's hurting both of you. You're missing out on knowing Miguel and Sofia, and they're missing out on knowing the woman who taught me what steady love looks like. I don't know how to fix this without destroying everything, but I need you to know that every day I don't tell you the truth is a day I feel like I'm stealing something from all of us." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. "Elena, why are you giving me these?" "Because they prove that Harold's love for you was real. Even when he was with us, even when he was fully committed to our life here, part of him was always wishing you could be part of it too." Standing there in the Texas sunshine, surrounded by Harold's other family, I finally understood something that had been eluding me since Elena's first phone call. Harold hadn't chosen Elena over me or me over Elena. He'd chosen love over logic, family over simplicity, and impossible joy over sensible limitations. He'd decided that loving two women completely was better than loving one woman partially, even if it meant living with the constant weight of deception. Was he right? I still didn't know, but I was beginning to understand that there might not be a right answer to the choice Harold had faced. Some situations are too complicated for moral absolutes. Some forms of love are too big for the containers society provides. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is find a way to give more of yourself than should be possible, even if it means living a lie. Harold had given Elena and her children a devoted father and husband. He'd given me 40 years of partnership and companionship. He'd given all of us the best version of himself he could manage, split across 2 states and 2 completely different lives. The cost had been enormous, 30 years of lies, the constant fear of discovery, and the weight of secrets that probably contributed to his heart problems. But the alternative would have been losing half the love he'd built, disappointing people who'd come to depend on him, and breaking promises to children who'd seen him as their anchor. I was beginning to think Harold had made the only choice he could live with, even if it was a choice that ultimately killed him. I stayed in San Antonio for 2 weeks after Harold's funeral, helping Elena sort through his belongings and trying to figure out what came next for both of us. Going through Harold's Texas possessions was like discovering an alternate version of the man I'd been married to for 40 years. His closet contained clothes I'd never seen, Hawaiian shirts Elena had bought him for Father's Day, a suit Miguel had helped him pick out for Sofia's wedding, and a leather jacket that looked nothing like Harold's careful Minnesota wardrobe. There were books he'd read that I'd never heard him mention, CDs of music he'd apparently loved but never played when he was with me, and photographs of family vacations I'd never been part of. In his home office, Elena and I found journals where Harold had documented both his lives, not the guilt and secrecy I'd expected, but detailed records of the joys and challenges of loving 2 families. Ruth brought me soup when I had the flu, read one entry from 2018. She sat by my bed all day, reading mystery novels out loud, even though I know she hates detective stories. I felt so loved, so cared for. I wish Elena could meet her. I think they'd be friends. Another entry from 2019. Sofia announced her pregnancy today. Elena cried with joy, and I realized I wanted to call Ruth immediately and share the news. She would have been so excited to know she was getting another grandchild, even if she's never met the first one. I'm depriving both my families of so much love by keeping them apart. Elena, I said, putting down the journal, did Harold ever talk about wanting to tell the truth? About bringing our families together? Constantly, especially in the last few years. After Sofia's daughter was born, Harold would look at family photos and get this sad expression. When I asked him what was wrong, he'd say he wished you could meet your granddaughter. My granddaughter? That's how he thought of Lucia, as your granddaughter too. He had this fantasy that somehow, someday, he'd find a way to bring everyone together. He'd imagine Sunday dinners with all of us. Holidays where the kids had grandparents from both families, and a life where he didn't have to choose between the people he loved. I thought about the grandchildren I'd never met, the son and daughter I'd never known I had, and the extended family that had been hidden from me for 3 decades. Elena, would it be possible for me to meet them? Lucia and Sofia's other children? You want to meet them? Harold considered them my grandchildren. Maybe it's time I considered them that way too. Sofia's house was a 20-minute drive from the hotel Elena and I were sharing. It was a modest ranch home in a neighborhood that reminded me of the one Harold and I had lived in when we were first married. Young families, well-maintained lawns, the kind of place where people looked out for each other. Sofia answered the door carrying Lucia, her 2-year-old daughter, who had Harold's blue eyes and Elena's dark curls. Behind her, a 4-year-old boy peered around his mother's legs with the shy curiosity of a child meeting a stranger. "Mama, who's this lady?" the boy asked. "This is Mrs. Morrison," Sofia said carefully. She was Grandpa Harold's other wife. The boy considered this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance children have for complicated adult relationships. "Does that mean she's my grandma too?" Sofia looked at me helplessly. "I don't know how to answer that." "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked the boy. "Diego. I'm 4 3/4. "Well, Diego, I was married to Grandpa Harold for a long time, which means I'm part of his family. And since you're part of his family, too, I guess that makes us family." "Cool. Do you want to see my trucks?" For the next 2 hours, I played with Diego's toy trucks while Lucia napped on my lap, and Sofia told me stories about Harold's relationship with her children. He'd been the kind of grandfather who got down on the floor for games, who remembered which bedtime stories were favorites, and who never missed a school play or soccer game. He was a wonderful grandfather, Sofia said. Patient, involved, always interested in what they were doing. When Lucia was born, he cried. He said she was the most beautiful baby he'd ever seen. Did he ever talk about other grandchildren? Your daughter's kids? He mentioned them sometimes. He'd say things like, Amanda's son is about Diego's age, or I bet Lucia would love to play with her cousin Emma. It was like he was imagining them all together. When it was time to leave, Diego hugged my legs. Grandma Ruth, are you going to come back and visit us? I looked at Sofia, who nodded. I hope so, sweetie. I hope so. That night, Elena and I sat on the hotel balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and trying to figure out what we were going to do with the rest of our lives. Ruth, Elena said, I need to ask you something. Are you planning to contest Harold's will? Legally, you're his wife, which means you're entitled to his assets. I'd been dreading this conversation. Harold's Texas life had been supported by money from our joint accounts in Minneapolis, money I'd assumed was going into our retirement fund. By rights, Elena and her children had been living on money that belonged to me. Elena, I want you and the kids to keep the house, the life insurance, everything Harold built for you here. I don't need the money, and I don't want to punish you for Harold's deception." That's incredibly generous. It's not generous. It's just right. Harold chose to support two families, and now that he's gone, both families should be able to continue the lives he made possible. What about you? What will you do now? I'd been thinking about that question for days. Harold's death had left me alone in a way I hadn't been since before we met. But it had also introduced me to a family I'd never known I had. People who'd shared Harold's love and could help me understand the man I'd been married to for 40 years. "I'm thinking about moving to San Antonio," I said. Elena nearly choked on her wine. "What?" "I'm 75 years old, Elena. My daughter is busy with her own life. My friends in Minneapolis are dying or moving to Florida. And I've just discovered that I have a son and daughter and grandchildren in Texas." Harold spent 30 years trying to figure out how to bring our families together. Maybe it's time one of us took the first step. "Ruth, you don't have to do that. You don't owe us anything. I'm not doing it out of obligation. I'm doing it because for the first time in 40 years, I have a chance to build something completely new. Harold's gone, but the love he created doesn't have to die with him. We can take all the love he gave both our families and use it to build something he never could. One family, honest and open, based on choice instead of secrecy." Elena stared at me in amazement. "You want to create the life Harold always fantasized about but never thought was possible." "Why not? We're both widows now. Miguel and Sofia could use another grandmother who wants to be involved in their lives. Diego and Lucia could use another grandparent who loves them unconditionally. And maybe both of us could use a friend who understands exactly what it means to love someone who was living a double life." "Ruth, are you sure about this? Moving to Texas, becoming part of our family, it's a huge change. Elena, I've spent 40 years living one kind of life. I'd like to spend whatever years I have left living a different kind of life. Harold showed us that it's possible to love more people than seems reasonable. Maybe it's time we learn to live that way too." The next morning, I called a realtor in San Antonio and started looking at houses. I moved to San Antonio 6 months later, buying a small house 3 blocks from Elena's neighborhood and 2 miles from Sofia's family. The transition wasn't easy. 75-year-old women aren't supposed to uproot their entire lives and start over in a new state. But it was the right decision. Amanda thought I'd lost my mind. "Mom," she said during one of our weekly phone calls, "you moved to Texas to live near the family of the man who lied to you for 40 years. Do you realize how crazy that sounds?" "What sounds crazy to me," I told her, "is wasting the rest of my life being angry about something I can't change instead of building something beautiful with the people who understand exactly what I've been through." "But they're strangers." "Mom, they're not our family. They were Harold's family for 30 years, which makes them part of my history whether I acknowledge them or not. And Amanda, they're not strangers anymore. Miguel helped me move my furniture. Sofia brings me dinner when I'm feeling lonely. Diego calls me Grandma Ruth and comes over to play in my garden. These people are choosing to love me, not because they have to, but because they want to." The first year was an adjustment for everyone. Miguel was still processing his anger about Harold's deception and sometimes looked at me like I was a living reminder of his father's lies. Sofia struggled with how to explain to her friends that her father's other wife had moved to San Antonio and was now part of their family. But slowly, we all began to understand that Harold's love had created connections between us that survived his death. Elena and I became genuine friends, bonded by the shared experience of loving the same, complicated man and the mutual understanding that comes from being betrayed and choosing forgiveness over bitterness, Miguel. And I discovered we both loved crossword puzzles and started meeting for coffee every Saturday to work through the weekend edition together. Sofia asked me to babysit Diego and Lucia when she needed time to herself. And I found that being a hands-on grandmother was more fulfilling than anything I'd done in retirement. The children adapted the fastest, as children do. To Diego and Lucia, I was simply another adult who loved them, another grandparent to call when they learned new words or wanted someone to watch them ride their bikes. They didn't care about the complicated history that had brought me into their lives. They only cared that I showed up consistently with homemade cookies and infinite patience for their games. 2 years after Harold's death, Elena was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. Without hesitation, I moved into her house during her chemotherapy treatments, taking care of her the way Harold would have wanted me to. We spent those long, difficult months talking about Harold, about the life we'd unknowingly shared, about the different ways we'd loved him, and about the different ways he'd loved us. "Ruth," Elena said one evening as we sat together during her recovery, "do you think Harold knew what he was doing? Do you think he planned for us to become friends? I think Harold hoped we would, but he was too scared to make it happen while he was alive. He was afraid that bringing us together would destroy what he'd built with both of us. Do you think he was right to be afraid?" I considered the question. Maybe. If I'd learned about you and the children 20 years ago, I probably would have demanded that Harold choose. I would have been too hurt, too angry, and too threatened to see that loving you didn't mean he loved me less. And now? Now I understand that love isn't a finite resource. Harold didn't run out of love by giving it to both our families. If anything, loving you and the children probably made him a better husband to me. He came back from San Antonio refreshed, grateful, and more appreciative of what we had together. Elena smiled weakly. He always said you were the wisest woman he knew. During Elena's recovery, Miguel, Sofia, and I grew closer than I'd ever imagined possible. We became a real family, not bound by blood or law, but by choice and shared experience and the legacy of Harold's complicated love. 3 years after Harold's death, Sofia asked me to walk her down the aisle at her second wedding. Her first marriage had ended in divorce, and she'd found love again with a man who embraced the unusual extended family she came with. "Ruth," she said as we practiced walking down the aisle, "I want you to know that having you in our lives has been one of the best things that came out of Dad's death. You've shown us that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about people choosing to love each other." The wedding was beautiful, held in Elena's backyard with string lights and roses from the garden Harold had planted years earlier. I sat in the front row next to Elena, holding Diego and Lucia, surrounded by the family Harold had built through 30 years of impossible choices. During the reception, Miguel raised a glass for a toast. "To my father, Harold Morrison, who taught us that love is big enough to hold more than we think possible. And to Ruth, who showed us that forgiveness can transform betrayal into blessing. Now I'm 78 years old, living in a city I never planned to call home, surrounded by a family I never knew existed. I spend my mornings having coffee with Elena, my afternoons babysitting grandchildren who call me Grandma Ruth, and my evenings reading to Diego and Lucia the same bedtime stories I once read to Amanda. Last month, Amanda finally came to visit San Antonio. She was hesitant at first, unsure how to navigate a relationship with the family her stepfather had hidden from us. But watching her laugh with Sofia over stories about Harold's terrible cooking, watching her teach Diego how to play chess, I realized that Harold's greatest gift wasn't just the love he'd given each of our families. It was the potential for connection he'd created between us. "Mom," Amanda said on her last night in Texas, "I have to admit you were right about this. Harold's other family isn't the enemy. They're just people who loved him the same way we did. And now they're people I love too. I've learned that some betrayals are too big for forgiveness, but some secrets are too complicated for simple judgment. Harold lived a double life for 30 years, but he also created double the love, double the family, and double the joy. His lies hurt us all, but his love saved us all too. The truth I've discovered at 78 is this: love isn't about ownership or exclusivity. It's about showing up, caring deeply, and choosing connection over pride. Harold showed up for 2 families for 30 years. Now Elena, Miguel, Sofia, and I show up for each other. Some people spend their lives trying to find one perfect love. Harold found 2 imperfect loves and made them both beautiful. Some people spend their lives afraid of being betrayed. I spent 3 years choosing trust over fear, and discovered that the family you build is often stronger than the family you're born with. Harold's secret family became my chosen family. His greatest deception became my greatest gift. At 78, I finally understand that love multiplies when you share it. And forgiveness creates space for miracles you never saw coming. Harold gave me 40 years of marriage. But Elena gave me something just as precious: the chance to love again, differently, better, with a heart broken open by betrayal and healed by the impossible grace of strangers who chose to become family. Some stories end with justice. Some end with revenge. Mine ends with the understanding that sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most unexpected blessings. And that love, real love, is always big enough to hold more than we think possible. At 78, I'm finally living the life Harold always dreamed we could all have together. One family, built not on lies but on the choice to love beyond reason, beyond hurt, beyond the safe boundaries of what makes sense. And that, I've learned, is how miracles happen. Thank you for listening to today's story from Granny Story Corner. Life teaches us lessons in the most unexpected ways, doesn't it? If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more real-life tales that remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, may your own story be filled with wisdom and love.